October 3rd, 2024. The Aegean Sea, 30 miles north of the Greek island of Donusa. A remotely operated vehicle descends through 830 feet of cold black water. On the research vessel above, Kostas Thoktorides watches a monitor. He's been searching for this submarine for more than 2 decades, 15 expeditions, thousands of hours of archival research, countless dead ends. And then the ROV's lights illuminate something on the seafloor. Steel, military grey, a torpedo loading hatch, still open after 81 years. He calls it awe-inspiring. That is probably the understatement of his career. The vessel on the seafloor is HMS Trooper, British T-class submarine, Royal Navy designation N91, 84 metres long, launched in Scotland in March 1942. She served for exactly 13 months before she disappeared. 64 men, no survivors, no radio contact, no wreckage found, just gone. For 81 years, she was listed as lost to a suspected mine somewhere in the eastern Aegean. Nobody could say where. Nobody could say exactly when. What actually happened to HMS Trooper had been one of the enduring mysteries of the Mediterranean War, until the morning Thoktorides' ROV touched bottom. But to understand why finding this particular submarine matters, and why it took 81 years, you need to go back to the autumn of 1943, to a war that was suddenly changing shape, to 3 men who stepped off a submarine onto a beach in occupied Greece and walked away into the dark, and to 1 man who heard a voice he thought he recognized, and sent every search team in the wrong direction for 20 years. This is the story of HMS Trooper, the submarine that delivered spies, the submarine that vanished, and the single mistake that hid her from history. Here is what the wreck told Thoktorides when he finally reached it. The submarine is broken into 3 distinct sections: bow, midships, stern. The stern section, the least damaged of the 3, runs 32 meters across the seafloor and is largely intact. The engine room telegraphs are still visible inside through the open hull. The midship section, where the crew lived and slept, is barely recognizable. The blast wave swept through the accommodation compartment and left almost nothing. The bow points downward into the silt. And on the conning tower, the command position from which a submarine is navigated on the surface, a hatch stands open. When HMS Trooper struck the mine, she was sailing on top of the water. Think about what that means. She was not diving, she was not evading. She was on the surface, which is where submarines go when they feel relatively safe. When a commander has weighed the risks and decided that navigating these waters on top is better than navigating them blind underneath. That open hatch is 64 men. It is the last operational decision Lieutenant John Wraith ever made. He was on the surface. He did not know about the mines. He was following his orders. And then he was gone. The explosion, Thoktorides concluded from the physical evidence, was catastrophic and instantaneous. The bow went down first, then the stern. The midship section, where men had slept, played cards, eaten, argued, passed the slow hours of a Mediterranean patrol, stayed on the surface for a few minutes longer before it too sank. 361 days after HMS Trooper had been commissioned into the Royal Navy, she was on the bottom of the Aegean Sea. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand how 64 men ended up sailing into a minefield on the exact same day the mines were laid, you need to understand September 1943. And you need to understand 3 men whose names are barely remembered today. And you need to understand who those 3 men were, the ones who got off the boat. Because their story is the reason Trooper was there. Their mission is what put 64 men in that part of the Aegean on that particular week. They were the last living people to see HMS Trooper. They walked off a beach in occupied Greece on October 1st, 1943, into a war that was consuming everything around them, and they survived. What they were carrying, and why, is a story that the British government kept classified for decades. It begins 6 months earlier, in a very different kind of mission, September 8th, 1943. The Italian government surrendered to the Allies. It had been coming for weeks. Mussolini had been deposed in July. Rome had been in quiet negotiation since August, but when the announcement came, it detonated a series of crises across the Mediterranean that nobody had fully anticipated. Because Italy had been occupying a chain of Greek islands in the Aegean, the Dodecanese, since 1912. 12 major islands: Rhodes, Kos, Leros, Kalymnos, dozens of smaller ones. And now, the Italian garrisons holding those islands were suddenly leaderless, confused, and in some cases willing to switch sides. The British saw an opportunity. If they could move fast enough, they could occupy the Dodecanese before the Germans arrived, gain naval and air bases in the eastern Mediterranean, threaten the German position in Greece and the Balkans, potentially change the calculus of the Southern War. Winston Churchill was particularly enthusiastic. The Americans were skeptical, preferring to concentrate resources on the Italian mainland. The British moved anyway. They landed on Kos, Leros, and Samos in early September. What followed became one of the more painful episodes of the entire Mediterranean campaign. And it is the reason HMS Trooper received the orders she did. The Germans had seen the same opportunity. They were faster. On September 11th, 3 days after Italy's surrender, the Luftwaffe struck the Dodecanese with everything available. German paratroopers seized Rhodes on September 12th, cutting off the largest British supply point in the region. British forces on Kos were overrun on October 3rd. Leros, the most heavily defended island, the one the British were most determined to hold, was under siege. And somewhere in the intelligence flowing into Beirut, into Cairo, into the SOE stations across the eastern Mediterranean, a question was taking shape. Who was actually on those islands? What was the Greek resistance doing? Who could be trusted and who had been compromised? This is where the spies enter the story. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, had been running agents in occupied Greece since 1941. Networks built on trust, on ideology, on money, on the particular Greek capacity for both fierce loyalty and fierce internal argument. Some of those networks had gone dark under German pressure. Others were operational, but out of contact, running on outdated orders, uncertain what Italy's collapse meant for their missions. What the SOE needed in the autumn of 1943 was intelligence, current, reliable, sourced from inside the occupation. And getting intelligence out of occupied Greece required people on the ground first. Getting agents into occupied territory in the Aegean meant submarines. You could not fly them in. The Luftwaffe controlled the air over the Greek islands. You could not use surface ships. German patrol boats and the newly laid German minefields controlled the sea lanes. But a submarine could navigate at night, surface off an isolated beach and put a rubber dinghy ashore in darkness. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean Submarine Force had been doing this kind of insertion work for 2 years. HMS Trooper had done it before. She was available, she was experienced, and she was commanded by an officer the Navy trusted completely. On September 26, 1943, she sailed from Beirut on her 8th war patrol. Lieutenant John Wraith was 30 years old. He had joined the Royal Navy at 17 and volunteered for submarines in his mid-20s. By 1943, he had accumulated a combat record that most officers twice his age would have envied. He had already won the Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for his part in sinking a German U-boat while serving as first lieutenant on HMS Cachalot in 1940. He had won a Distinguished Service Order commanding HMS Upright. He was, by the Royal Navy's own assessment, among the best submarine commanders it had in the Mediterranean. His crew knew him by a characteristic that would later play a central, tragic role in the search for the submarine. He had a loud voice. You could hear Wraith hailing a vessel from some distance away. HMS Trooper herself had a history that set her apart from most submarines of her class. Her very first operation, before she had even fired a torpedo in anger, involved human torpedoes. In the early hours of January 3rd, 1943, she surfaced off the coast of Sicily and launched 3 chariots. 2-man underwater vehicles, each carrying a demolition charge, piloted by volunteers in diving gear, toward the heavily defended Italian port of Palermo. It required a specific kind of nerve. The submarine surfaced in enemy waters at night, held position while trained operators mounted their vehicles and disappeared into the dark, then waited. One chariot successfully damaged a large Italian troopship. One crew member was lost. Trooper recovered what she could and withdrew. After Palermo, HMS Trooper spent 8 months as a hunter in the Mediterranean. She sank the Italian tanker Rosario. She sank the merchant ship Forlì south of Capri. She hunted convoys across the Ionian Sea and the approaches to Naples, firing torpedoes at convoys under escort and surviving the depth charges that followed. In July 1943, she sank the Italian submarine Pietro Mica, a significant kill, since Pietro Mica was herself on a resupply mission. Trooper was decorated, experienced, and well-led. She had 13 months of operational service in the toughest submarine theater of the war. When she sailed from Beirut on September 26th, nothing about her pointed toward the bottom of the Aegean Sea. The 3 agents who boarded HMS Trooper before she left Beirut were not sailors. They were intelligence officers, and they carried materials that did not appear on the submarine's standard manifest. The first was Major Georgios Diamantopoulos, a Greek army officer seconded to the British SOE. His mission was designated Operation Eruption. He was to operate independently, which in SOE terminology meant that his specific tasking and contacts were known only to his handlers. The full details of what Operation Eruption required of Diamantopoulos remain partially classified in the British National Archives, even now. What can be confirmed is that he was a senior officer with established connections to the Greek resistance and that his mission was considered important enough to justify deploying an entire submarine. The second agent was Lieutenant Emmanuel Weiss, a Greek naval officer working with British intelligence. His tasking orders related directly to the situation in the Dodecanese, almost certainly to the German movements against Leros, the positions of Italian forces that might still be persuaded to cooperate, and the status of Greek resistance networks on the islands under siege. What Weiss was supposed to find out, and who he was supposed to contact, could have influenced operational decisions affecting thousands of lives. The battle for Leros was still being fought. The intelligence Weiss carried back, or transmitted by radio, would arrive when it might still matter. The third man's real name has never been publicly confirmed. In the operational records, he is listed only as Thomas, his radio operator codename. He was not an officer. He was a trained signal specialist, and he carried the equipment that would allow Diamantopoulos and Weiss to communicate with their handlers after they were ashore. In intelligence work, the radio operator is often the most valuable person in a clandestine network, and the most exposed. Without Thomas and his equipment, the other 2 men were isolated inside enemy territory with no way to transmit what they found. With him, they were a functioning cell. 400 kilograms of supplies went into the operation with them. Money, weapons, spare radio parts, code books, everything 3 men would need to survive and operate behind German lines for an extended period. There is something worth pausing on here. The specific arithmetic of what 400 kilograms of supplies meant. Money, gold sovereigns, the universal currency of the resistance, untraceable, negotiable anywhere. Weapons, not for major operations, but for protection, for leverage, for the practical reality of moving through occupied territory. Codebooks and spare radio parts, the components that would keep Thomas's transmitter running for months rather than weeks. And buried in the manifest, alongside everything else, almost certainly, were things the British archives still do not itemize in unredacted documents. The 400 kilograms were not merely supplies. They were the architecture of a network that was expected to function for a very long time. The insertion took place on the night of September 30th into October 1st, 1943. The location was the island of Kalamos, on the western coast of mainland Greece, not in the Dodecanese itself, but well positioned as a staging and contact point for resistance networks operating across the wider region. Kalamos was relatively small and quiet, with civilian infrastructure still functioning despite occupation. It was exactly the kind of location the SOE preferred for insertions. Isolated enough to minimize the risk of German patrols at the moment of landing, but connected enough to the broader resistance network to serve as a useful entry point. HMS Trooper approached the island on the surface after dark. The procedure for this type of agent insertion was well established by 1943. The submarine would surface at a prearranged position offshore and make a recognition signal. If the response from shore was correct, a specific light pattern, a specific countersign, a rubber dinghy would be launched from the submarine. The agents would transfer to the dinghy with their equipment. The dinghy would be paddled to shore, the agents and supplies would be offloaded, and the dinghy would return to the submarine. Then Trooper would dive and withdraw. The whole process, from surfacing to submergence, was meant to be completed as quickly as possible. The longer a submarine sat stationary on the surface in enemy waters, the greater the risk. It was the kind of operation the crew had done before. It was the kind of operation they were good at. The insertion was completed successfully. Major Diamantopoulos, Lieutenant Vase, and the man called Thomas stepped off the dinghy onto Greek soil on October 1st, 1943. 400 kilograms of supplies came ashore with them. The dinghy went back to Trooper. What was said on that beach, whether resistance contacts were waiting to receive the agents, whether they moved immediately into the interior or spent the night in a safe house near the water, is not recorded in any document that has been made public. What is recorded is that all 3 men survived the war. Their missions produced results. Diamantopoulos gathered intelligence under Operation Eruption and transmitted it through Thomas's radio. Vase made contact with the networks he had been briefed to reach. The radio worked. When they stepped off that dinghy and walked up the beach, the submarine disappeared behind them into the Aegean night. 64 men, all of them alive, all of them doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Wraith had new orders. Patrol the waters between the islands of Donusa and Ikaria from October 6th to October 9th, ahead of a planned movement toward Leros. It was a standard patrol assignment in a well-established operational area. Nothing in the orders suggested unusual risk. Nobody in Beirut had flagged the region as particularly dangerous. She had survived 7 war patrols in some of the most contested waters in the Mediterranean. This was the 8th, the one that was supposed to end like the others, with a return to Beirut. What none of them knew, what nobody in Beirut knew, what British naval intelligence had not yet established, was what the German minelayer Drac had done on September 26, 1943. On the exact same day, HMS Trooper sailed from Beirut. While Trooper was making her way eastward toward the Aegean, the Drac was working north of Donusa. 5 minefields, 287 anti-submarine mines, laid directly across the area where Trooper had just been ordered to patrol, in the very stretch of water between Donusa and Ikaria that she would be crossing between October 6th and October 9th. The minefield was complete before she arrived. There is a particular cruelty to this timing that does not diminish with repetition. HMS Trooper and the Drac were both underway on September 26th, heading in roughly the same direction, toward the same general area of sea, and on opposite sides of the war. The mines were in the water before Trooper even reached the Aegean. Nobody had intercepted her orders. The Germans were not specifically hunting her. They were laying defensive barriers across their newly seized island positions. Trooper was sent to monitor those same positions. The collision between those 2 facts, the minefield and the patrol order, was coincidence. Catastrophic, irreversible, unforeseeable coincidence. If you want to understand what happened next, the final days of HMS Trooper, reconstructed almost hour by hour, stay with us. Because in the next section of this video, we are going to walk through those days using the German minefield records, the British patrol orders, and the physical evidence from the wreck itself. Back to October 1943. The agents are ashore. The submarine has withdrawn. And somewhere north of Donusa, in waters no British chart had yet marked as dangerous, 287 German mines are waiting, laid on the exact same morning HMS Trooper left Beirut. The collision between those 2 facts was not planned. It was not intelligence. It was coincidence. And coincidence in the autumn of 1943 was enough. October 6th, 1943. HMS Trooper enters her assigned patrol area north of Danusa. The Drache's mines have been on the seafloor for 10 days, laid directly across these coordinates. Trooper is navigating from charts compiled before the German mine-laying operation. Charts that show clean water here, no hazards recorded. She is on the surface. The conning tower hatch is open. Wraith, or one of his watch officers, is on the bridge. The Aegean Sea is running hard as it usually does. Strong northerly winds, sharp chop, powerful underwater currents that make navigation unpleasant and visibility poor. Standard conditions for this part of the Aegean. Nothing to indicate that the water beneath them is anything other than what the charts say it is. October 7th. October 8th. The submarine works its patrol box, covering the assigned zone. Below her keel, at varying depths, 287 German mines wait on their tether cables. Above her, the Aegean sky. Around her, empty water. No enemy contacts reported because none were made. October 9th. The last day of the assigned patrol window before Trooper was due to shift position toward Leros. At some point in these 4 days, in waters she had every reason to believe were clear, HMS Trooper struck a mine. The exact moment cannot be determined from the wreck. A contact detonation does not leave a timestamp on the steel it destroys. What the physical evidence tells us is what happened afterward. And it happened in seconds. October 17th, 1943. HMS Trooper does not arrive in Beirut. The naval staff begins signaling her. No response. October 17th becomes October 18th. October 19th. Still nothing. On October 20th, 1943, the Admiralty officially lists HMS Trooper as lost with all hands. The telegrams that went out to 64 families across Britain that autumn used the standard language for submarine losses. Lost on active service, in the execution of their duty, presumed dead. It told the families nothing useful. No location, no cause, no grave, just the fact of absence, formalized into language, delivered to a door. And now the story takes the turn that would define the next 80 years of searching. Because in the weeks after Trooper disappeared, a report came in that seemed to answer at least one question: where she had been. On October 14th, 1943, a British vessel operating in the Aegean reported an encounter with a T-class submarine. The vessel was Kaik LS-8, part of the Levant schooner flotilla, a covert unit of small wooden fishing boats running agents and supplies among the Greek islands. The officer commanding Kaik LS-8 was Lieutenant Commander Adrian Seligman. Seligman reported that in Alinda Bay on the island of Leros, a T-class submarine had surfaced alongside his Kaik, and he was confident that he had recognized the voice of the officer who hailed him from the conning tower. He believed it was Lieutenant Wraith. He believed it was HMS Trooper. After the war, Seligman wrote a book, War in the Islands. In it, he described the encounter in detail, the submarine surfacing beside him in the dark, the officer's voice carrying across the water, the recognition. He had known Wraith. He had recognized what he called his loud voice. He was certain it was Trooper. Since this sighting coincided with Trooper's orders, she was scheduled to be off Leros at around that time, it was accepted. And the search began there. The first organized search for HMS Trooper began in 1998, 55 years after she was lost. Initial archival research in England was followed by the first underwater search in 2000. It focused on the minefields around Leros, Kalamos, and Kos, the waters where Seligman had placed the submarine. Over the next 2 decades, 14 expeditions followed. They searched 10 separate minefields in the Dodecanese region. They found nothing. The absence of wreckage was more than puzzling, it was professionally troubling. T-class submarines are large steel vessels. They do not simply disappear from a minefield without leaving any detectable remains. The searches were thorough. The equipment was capable, and still nothing. The families of the 64 men were watching all of this. Some of them had been waiting since 1943. The searches that began in 2000 had brought hope. The technology existed, the will existed, experienced people were looking. Each failed expedition was reported. Each time a search team concluded it had covered the likely area and found nothing, the families received the news that the mystery continued. For the children and grandchildren of men lost before they were born, or before they were old enough to remember, the absence of a location was a particular kind of unresolved grief. The kind that cannot find a place to rest because there is no place to point to on a map. Thoctarides had been involved in several of these expeditions. He knows the work. He has located 8 submarines in his career. He knows the difference between an area that has been thoroughly searched and an area that simply contains nothing to find. By 2023, after more than 2 decades of Dodecanese minefields coming up empty, he had developed a theory that was uncomfortable in its implications. What if Seligman was wrong? What if the submarine he encountered in Alinda Bay on October 14th was not Trooper at all, but another T-class submarine? They were all built to the same plans. They all sounded alike from a distance at night. And Trooper had been somewhere else entirely when she struck the mine. This was not a comfortable proposition. Seligman was a credible, experienced officer. His account had been published in a book. It had been cited as foundational evidence in the search research. To challenge it meant saying that everyone who had organized expeditions around his testimony had been searching the wrong part of the Aegean for 24 years. Thoctarides went back to the raw records anyway. He worked through British, Greek, and German archives. He examined the logbooks of every T-class submarine operating in the Aegean in October 1943. He mapped their positions against their orders. And the more he cross-referenced, the more the geometry did not work. If Trooper had been in Alinda Bay on October 14th, still operational, hailing Seligman from the bridge, then she had disappeared in a 2-day window before October 17th. Possible. But 10 minefields in the Dodecanese had been searched with modern equipment and had produced nothing. Meanwhile, the German records contained a document that no previous Trooper researcher had connected to the case. The operational logs of the minelayer Drac. 5 minefields, 287 mines, north of Danusa. Laid September 26th, in the exact zone where Trooper had been ordered to patrol from October 6th to October 9th, before her scheduled move to Leros. The connection was direct, the geography was exact, the timing was fatal. The conclusion Thoctarides reached was not dramatic, it was methodical. The Seligman sighting was a case of mistaken identity, an honest error made at night, at distance, on the basis of a voice that sounded like a voice from memory. The submarine in Alinda Bay on October 14th was a different T-class vessel. And HMS Trooper had been lying on the floor of the Aegean Sea at 253 meters, since sometime between October 6th and October 9th, undiscovered because every search expedition had been sent 60 miles to the east, chasing a ghost sighting from a credible witness who had simply been wrong. Thoctarides proposed a 15th expedition, this time north of Danusa. They found her on October 3rd, 2024. The sonar hit came first, a large mass on the seafloor, the right dimensions, the right profile for an 84-meter submarine. The ROV went down. Images came back in stages, the torpedo loading hatch on the foredeck still in place. The conning tower, open hatch pointing upward into the dark water. The stern section, 32 meters long, engine room telegraphs still visible inside through the fractured hull. The comparison to original Royal Navy shipbuilding plans made by Scotts of Greenock in 1942 was the confirmation. The hull dimensions, the fittings, the structural layout. This was HMS Trooper, designation N91, found at last. The physical evidence from the wreck supports a specific and coherent reconstruction of the final moments. The mine detonated at or near the bow. The bow section shows the most catastrophic damage, the greatest structural failure. The explosion propagated along the length of the hull with enough force to shear the vessel into 3 sections and strip the midships accommodation compartment almost clean. The stern, farthest from the detonation point, sustained the least damage and remains largely coherent. And the open conning tower hatch confirms what the mine records suggested. Trooper was on the surface, proceeding normally on patrol when she struck. There was no time to dive. There was no warning. The wreck also tells us something important about what it did not show. HMS Trooper was not battle damaged before she hit the mine. There is no evidence of prior torpedo attack, no signs of earlier structural compromise, no indication that the submarine was in any difficulty in the days between October 1st and October 9th. She had completed her mission. The agents were ashore. The resupply was done. She was conducting a routine patrol in waters she had been ordered to cover, in a submarine that was fully operational, crewed by 64 men who had no reason to expect anything other than a patrol and a return to Beirut. The mine ended it in an instant. Seligman's mistake deserves to be treated fairly. He was not incompetent. He was not fabricating. He was an experienced officer operating in the Aegean under significant stress in October 1943, and he heard a voice from a conning tower in the dark that sounded like the voice of a man he knew. Human memory, under operational conditions, is not a recording device. It is a pattern-matching system. It reaches for the nearest plausible fit. Wraith had a loud voice. Another officer on another T-class submarine may have had a similar carrying voice at distance across water at night. Seligman connected what he heard to what he expected, and he wrote it down honestly. The error was genuine. The consequences lasted decades. What happened to the 3 agents after October 1st? Diamantopoulos, Vase, and the man called Thomas were in one sense the only survivors of HMS Trooper's last mission, though they had been ashore for days before the mine struck, and had no way of knowing the submarine had been lost until the silence stretched past the point of explanation. Post-war records confirm that all 3 men survived the German occupation of Greece. Diamantopoulos completed Operation Eruption and transmitted intelligence back through Thomas's radio. Vase made contact with the networks he had been tasked to reach. The information they gathered during their time in occupied Greece contributed to British understanding of the Dodecanese situation through the critical months of late 1943. The broader significance of their work is difficult to measure precisely, but the context gives it weight. When Kos fell in early October 1943 and Leros fell in November, when the British strategic gamble in the Dodecanese collapsed entirely, the agent networks that had been built, supplied, and maintained by missions like theirs became the primary means of tracking what was happening inside Greece. The 400 kilograms of supplies that HMS Trooper carried ashore on Kalamos, the money, the weapons, the codes, the radio equipment, sustained resistance activity that continued operating until German forces withdrew from mainland Greece in October 1944. The last mission of HMS Trooper was not a failure. In the language the SOE used for its operations, it was a success. The 64 men who made that success possible are commemorated on the Portsmouth Naval Memorial, Panel 72. Lieutenant John Wraith, 30 years old at the time of his death. DSO, DSC, husband of Elizabeth Wraith, who had already lost one husband to the sea. Lieutenant John Moore, killed on HMS Royal Oak when a German U-boat sank her at anchor in Scapa Flow in October 1939. Elizabeth Wraith and John Wraith had met because he and Moore had served together, had been friends. She outlived both of them. Their son Richard was born, or had already been born, before Trooper sailed. He grew up without a father. He joined the Royal Navy anyway. Richard Wraith followed his father into the service and eventually reached the rank of captain, the same rank his father never lived to attain. He had followed the search for HMS Trooper for years, through the failed expeditions, through the repeated disappointments in the Dodecanese minefields, through the periods when it seemed the submarine might remain lost indefinitely. When Thoctarides contacted him with the news in October 2024, Richard Wraith spoke to the Greek news agency ANA-MPA. He was pleased, he said. He had known for years about the research team's efforts, and he was very glad their work had been rewarded. And then he said something that deserves to be quoted directly and without reduction. I hope that any family members of those lost with my father may be able to use the definitive location of Trooper as a focal point to help lay to rest any memories of their loved ones. He did not reach for the word closure. He said, lay to rest any memories. The memories of people who had grown up not knowing. People whose fathers, brothers, uncles had disappeared on a Mediterranean patrol in the autumn of 1943 and left behind nothing but a telegram and a name on a stone wall. Now there was a location, a depth, a set of coordinates in international waters north of Danusa in the Aegean Sea. Not a grave in the traditional sense, but a place, a specific, verifiable, identified place. HMS Trooper has been designated a protected war grave. The wreck site will not be disturbed. At 253 meters, beyond recreational diving depth, beyond casual access, it will remain where it is. The ROV footage is the record. The sonar mapping is the record. Thoctorides noted in his statement that this was the 8th submarine he had found in his career, and that the key to locating it had been the German archival record, the Drache's mine-laying logs, which had been sitting in German naval archives for decades, open to researchers, never before cross-referenced systematically against the HMS Trooper search file. The answer was in the documents. It had been there all along. 26 years of underwater searching, 15 expeditions, 10 minefields searched in the wrong part of the Aegean, and the answer was in a German naval archive, in the routine operational log of a minelayer that had done its work on September 26, 1943. The same morning, a British submarine with 64 men aboard sailed out of Beirut. One honest mistake, made in the dark on the water in October 1943, sent every subsequent search to the wrong coordinates. Everything that followed from Seligman's error was reasonable given what he reported. The cost of that error was 20 years and 14 failed expeditions. That is not a story about incompetence. It is a story about how fragile the path from evidence to truth can be. There is one more piece that belongs in this account. The 3 agents whose safety was the purpose of Trooper's last mission, the reason 64 men were in the Aegean on that particular patrol in that particular week, lived to see the end of the war. Their missions produced the intelligence they had been sent to gather. The networks they reached continued operating, and the submarine that carried them there, the submarine that made their survival possible by delivering them safely and withdrawing, that submarine lay undiscovered for 81 years, while the families of its crew received no answer, no location, no confirmation of anything beyond the silence after the telegram. The conning tower hatch is still open. 81 years of the Aegean Sea have moved through it. Cold currents from the north, the strong winds and powerful underwater flows that Thoctorides described as making these among the most difficult waters in the Mediterranean. The torpedo loading hatch on the foredeck is still in position. The engine room telegraphs are still visible in the fractured stern. And north of the Greek island of Danusa, at 253 meters, the submarine that was built in Greenock and launched in March 1942 and sent to the Mediterranean and given missions and agents and minefields, that submarine is still there. 3 men walked off it alive on the night of October 1st, 1943, and carried their mission into the occupied interior of Greece. 64 men did not come back. Their son became a captain. A Greek diver refused to accept that the search was over. And on October 3rd, 2024, the ROV lights came on at the bottom of the Aegean Sea, and the open hatch was there exactly as it had been left.